First, thank you to the organizers for asking me to speak, and thank you to all of you for sticking around to the end of a fabulous but very busy kind of day. And Charles has already given away my title. I figured if we had one acronym, we might as well have two. OEIS is, of course, the database that we're here celebrating, amongst other things, this week. And I was asked to give a student-friendly talk, and I figured one of the best ways to do that was to showcase joint work I've been doing with students over the past 5 years at Valparaiso University. So in the next half hour, I'll share some results that have been done by these three groups of students. The top two groups are groups that attended Valparaiso's NSF-funded summer research program, and then the group on the bottom is a group of Valpo students who worked with me during an academic year. And along the way, I'll try to highlight at least 4 different ways that I think OEIS helps make my students better mathematicians as they're just getting started. But before I start showing you their projects, I was thinking more about the title of this conference, which is Challenges in Identifying Integer Sequences. And I think there's an extra kind of challenge if you're an undergraduate who has just finished your first proof-based class. My experience is that most undergraduates come to college with 2 words for sequences, represented by the 2 you see up here. They know arithmetic and geometric, and that's what gets reviewed in Calc 2. And that's about their whole vocabulary. So if you give them more sequences without more classes, they're at a loss for words. Maybe you get some ambitious ones who have seen the Fibonacci numbers and are convinced they have magical properties. And they kind of do, but then you convince them that's just a special case of something that follows a linear recurrence, and maybe if I take the same recurrence and just change the base cases, I get another interesting sequence, and lo and behold, it has a name too. But still, you get your best students to about their junior year, and this is their personal encyclopedia of sequences, so whereas when I see these 4 sequences, I go, oh, I have something good to work on, they might just see noise. And I'm sure that there are people in this room who can name all 4 of these, or at least a subset of these. Right? If you're an enumerator especially, we have the Catalan numbers, which you should recognize after Richard Stanley's talk. We have Motzkin, Schroeder, and Bell numbers up here as well. And so I think a particular challenge for students is finding context for their work. Whereas I see some sequences and say, oh, this has nice connections, let's explore this avenue next. My students don't necessarily know where to start without some help, and so OEIS helps them start to make up for their lack of years of experience by allowing them to search and get a little bit more context. Now let me tell you a little bit more about some of the problems the students have been working on, and show you how OEIS has helped them beyond saying, ooh, here was a sequence somebody's seen before. So the project that I had students work on this summer has to do with pattern avoidance, which we've already heard referred to in several talks today, but I think this is the first time it's been defined generally instead of for a specific pattern. I have the set of permutations of length 3 up here, not because I think that's a surprise, but to emphasize I think of permutations in one-line notation, just as a list of distinct integers instead of with algebraic properties. And I say a permutation of length n contains a permutation of length m if you can find a subsequence within the larger permutation that appears in the same relative order. So for example, 1, 4, 2, 3, 5 contains 1, 3, 2 because the subsequence you see in boxes appears in small, large, medium order. They don't have to be adjacent positions, they don't have to be consecutive values, they just have to have the same relative order. However, this avoids 4, 3, 2, 1 because there's no decreasing subsequence of length 4. And when I want to give just starting out undergraduates an interesting problem to get started, I don't want to give them something that's right in the mainstream because they'll get scooped. I want to change one word so they're doing something a little bit new. So this summer, we didn't look at permutations. We looked at special kinds of words we call double lists, where you take a permutation and you append it to itself. So there are still n factorial double lists on the set of n letters. Here are the ones on 3 letters. And we're especially interested in this set at the bottom, the set of double lists on n letters that avoid a given permutation pattern. Now, in the interest of being especially student-friendly, I'm going to start with the smallest patterns we can and see when the sequences start to get non-trivial. So how do you avoid the pattern of length 1? Well, you can't do it if you have any digits. A digit is a 1 pattern. And when you have at least 2 digits, you can't avoid a pattern of length 2, because, for example, if I take the 1 out of the first copy of the permutation in my double list, and the 2 out of the second copy, there's my 1-2 pattern. So avoiding things of length 1 and of length 2, pretty straightforward, but hopefully good exercises in making sure the definitions are clear. And when I think about these, I don't really think about lists of integers. I think about these double lists as a discrete function from 1 up to 2n to the set 1 up to n. So this is the graph I would draw for the double list 1, 4, 2, 3, 5, 1, 4, 2, 3, 5. Now this picture is nice because it simplifies my work. This rectangle has some symmetries. So for example, if I flip it with a horizontal reflection, I get the reverse. If I flip it with a vertical reflection, I get the complement. And doing those reflections gives me some bijections. So the number of double lists avoiding row is equal to the number of double lists avoiding row's reverse, and is equal to the number of double lists avoiding the complement. That means instead of 6 patterns of length 3 to consider, I really only have 2 to look at. And unlike the permutation case, which we saw earlier today, has Catalan numbers showing up, this is a much more restrictive kind of problem. We're getting simpler things here. So for n greater than or equal to 3, the only way to avoid 1, 2, 3 is to take the decreasing pattern followed by itself. You can look at the decreasing pattern followed by itself and think, where could I insert n plus 1? If you tried to put it after the n, the 1 and n in the middle, followed by the second copy of n plus 1 is your 1, 2, 3. And similar case analysis gives us that it's impossible to avoid 1, 3, 2 in this double list problem after n equals 4. Okay, well, impossible to contain, whichever sentence matches what's up there. So the interesting sequences don't happen until you start avoiding patterns of length 4, and here come some sequences. When you start out, you get some brute force data, and this is the data we've computed for n up to 10 for any of the patterns of length 4. These are grouped according to the reverse and complement symmetries I mentioned on the previous slide. So I know, for example, the number of 1, 3, 4, 2 avoiders has to match the number of 2, 4, 3, 1 avoiders because those are reverses of each other. And in fact, I can get at most 8 different sequences, and I get exactly 8 different sequences. We see things branching off here. And for contrast, if you're aware of pattern avoiding permutations, which were mentioned earlier today in the problem session, you only get 3 different sequences, and I've color-coded to match that. All the rows in green have patterns that, if you looked at pattern avoiding permutations, are equivalent to avoiding 1, 3, 4, 2, and so on with black and blue. I think it's interesting that we don't get just green rows, then black rows, then blue rows, that these are all shuffled. So the project this summer was to understand what is going on here. Can we prove formulas for these sequences?
So there's no non-trivial Lara equivalence?
No, there's no non-trivial Lara equivalence or my students' equivalence either. I try not to think about it unless they're in the room. So I'm going to talk in this talk particularly about the first row and the last row. I think most of you would be confident making a conjecture about what the first row is doing, and maybe the last row takes some thought. So the first row is a good example of the first kind of proof a student who's just come out of their sophomore year of college might try to do. They start listing examples. So these are the pictures of the double lists on 6 digits that avoid the pattern 1, 3, 4, 2. And if you draw them all out and try to rearrange them, you notice that if you ignore the largest 2 letters, there's really only 3 shapes you can get. And you see in the top left corner, you can have decreasing followed by 1, 2. You see below that, you have decreasing except for the 2 and 3 are in increasing order, or you have decreasing. And then case analysis, there's a few things you can do with the largest 2 digits. And even before we arranged things in this way, the students made an argument an awful lot like 1, 3, 2 avoiders, where they said, oh, here's everything. Let me look at where I can insert the next largest digit. Oh, I got the same 15 pictures back. So this is a very comfortable proof for the undergraduates to do in that they can do it by cases without building up a lot more machinery. But you can't do this with all 8 of those sequences from the previous slide. So let's go to the last sequence. It turns out that the 1, 2, 3, and 4 avoiders have this enumeration right here. And again, the comfortable thing for the undergraduates to start with is working by cases. So you either have 1 before n, like in the picture on the left, or 1 after n, like in the picture on the right. Turns out, again, some analysis by cases, if 1 comes before n, you start out with the first few digits are the smallest digits appearing in decreasing order, and then they're followed by the largest digits in decreasing order, and then you repeat yourself. And we have a similar phenomenon going on the right, except for between the n and the 1, you get to go back and forth between the upper run and the lower run. Now, the student temptation is to keep going by cases and say, okay, well, how many of these have 1 in the first position? How many have 1 in the second position? And add up a lot of binomials. However, this is another way I think OEIS makes them stronger. If we search for this sequence, the A number will be on the next slide, but this is one of the first descriptions of this sequence. It's the number of permutations you get from a deck of n cards produced by a single shuffle. So think of your deck with n on the top and 1 on the bottom. You cut it, and then you shuffle them. Well, the pictures on the left are when I cut and just flip the 2 stacks, and the ones on the right are when I cut and actually interleave. And, well, every card's coming from the upper or the lower deck, so this looks an awful lot like powers of 2, except I've overcounted just slightly, because what if I cut and then just put my 2 stacks back together? So it turns out, thanks to OEIS, it empowers them to write a simpler proof than they would otherwise going back to their usual habits. So I think that is way number 2. OEIS empowers my students. And that was one of the results we were most proud of this summer. So back to the list. I had sequences up here before. Now you see what happened this summer. We managed to get all 8 sequences, which was especially exciting for that next to last row. The one that came up in the problem session was nobody knows a formula for the number of 1, 3, 2, 4 avoiding permutations. And it turns out there's a lot of noise before it starts picking up a Fibonacci recurrence. It doesn't start till about n equals 10, which is pushing the limits of what the undergraduates had computed. And yet, we broke it into cases, and each of the 4 cases, well, maybe 2 or 3 of them, followed Fibonacci recurrences with starting values that were in OEIS, which led us to look closer at the remaining cases, add them together, and you still follow that recurrence. So we got the whole thing, but would not have been able to do it without this tremendous resource. So we're up to 2 things so far. I think OEIS helps my students do. It gives them context when they have data so that they know when they have something they should be looking at a little bit closer for more connections. It also helps them write cleaner proofs. So let's move on to another project. The one I've just shown you was this past summer. This next project was from, I think, 3 years ago. And it's still a pattern avoidance problem, but in another context. Here we're going to look at pattern avoiding trees. And we're interested in very particular trees. So our trees are rooted, and I draw my roots at the top of the page. They're ordered, so I can tell the left subtree from the right subtree. And they're full binary, so every vertex has exactly 0 or 2 children. And I want to know how many trees with n leaves avoid a given pattern. Now I have to tell you what tree pattern is. For our problem, tree patterns follow this definition. A big tree, like the one on the left, contains a smaller tree. If you can take pairs of edges that emanated from the same vertex and contract them, and do a series of those contractions by pairs to get the smaller tree. So you see this tree on the left contains this tree up here at the top. It contains the middle tree here at the bottom. And then that last one's the sneakiest one, but if you contract the non-bolded edges, there's the tree on the far right. And so again, we start with small examples and see when things get interesting. And here are the small examples. Again, you can't avoid a one-leaf tree because every tree has a root. The only way to avoid the two-leaf tree is to be the one-leaf tree. And then avoiding this left-leaning tree, you have to always lean to the right. Now, this last row is where things start to get interesting. The idea for tree patterns actually came from a paper by Eric Rowland where he had a different definition of pattern, and he got 2 different sequences out of these 3 patterns. But with the definition I just showed you, the number of trees avoiding, take your pick of these 3, always gave us powers of 2. Now, if you're bold and like making conjectures based on 4 examples, you might say maybe the number of leaves in my tree pattern doesn't matter. And it turns out in this case being bold pays off, and that's the case. So if AB sub t of n is the number of n-leaf trees avoiding t, and g sub t of x is the corresponding generating function, it turns out you pick your favorite positive integer, and you pick 2 trees with that number of leaves, and you're going to get the same generating function for both of them. And I'm going to show you why that is before I get to sequences, because I think it builds up a little bit machinery to make the sequences make more sense. So a little bit more notation. If I have a tree, I'll let T sub L be the subtree to the left of the root and T sub R be to the right. And a larger tree avoids little t if either the left subtree avoids TL or the right subtree avoids TR, or both. So here's how we'd say that in generating functions. If I avoid T, I'm either the one-leaf tree, or I avoid TL on the left or TR on the right, but wait, I've overcounted, so I subtract. And solving for G sub T of X, we've got this nice recursive formula. So in fact, this gives me a reason I'm always going to see rational generating functions in this case, because the small examples all have rational generating functions, and I'm making a rational combination of them. So let's look a little bit closer at this formula in a special case, and then we'll get back to the theorem. I'll call these trees that always lean to the left combs. And with combs, the left subtree and the right subtree are particularly nice. The left subtree is another comb, and the right subtree is the one-leaf tree. But since it's impossible to avoid the one-leaf tree, two of these terms cancel out, and I get a much simpler recurrence. And so now taking that back to our main theorem, you can prove this by induction. You're just going to assume, when you have an integer k in mind, that any tree with less than k leaves has the comb generating function we had a recurrence for on the previous slide. You plug in and do induction, and you've got the result. So now we know it just depends on the number of leaves in the tree. What kind of sequences are we going to get? I can use that comb recurrence, and we've seen these first 4 sequences already. The ways to avoid a 3-leaf tree, there's just one tree that does that. We see powers of 2 for k equals 4. It turns out the k equals 5 is every second Fibonacci number. The next one is powers of 3. I forget if it's plus or minus 1 over 2. We're getting very nice formulas. So the next question to my undergrads is, well, what's the pattern here? I could compute recursively all day, but if I tell you my favorite number is 1,052,052, do you really want to do this 1,052,052 times? So we'll lose the a numbers for a second and just save the generating functions. And I'll point out one thing, and then I'll ask you what you see. It should not be surprising that the denominator of one generating function looks an awful lot like the numerator of the next one. That came from that recurrence we saw with the combs. I'm just taking the x over 1 minus the previous generating function. That's an artifact of the recurrence. But do you recognize these coefficients? Okay, Neil does. Where have you seen them, Neil?
I won't answer.
You won't answer.
Just n, right? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the diagonal.
Okay, so for the coefficients of x squared in the numerator, yes, those are natural numbers. Yeah, one day after staring at this for a bit, my students came in with a copy of Pascal's triangle colored in about 15 different colors. These coefficients are coming from diagonals of Pascal's triangle, and they would not have seen this result without a bit of searching in the database. So the database helps them generalize. And thanks to this realization, they were able to prove this more general result and say, okay, you have your favorite integer, this is what happens, we can prove this by induction. So again, these students have just come out of their first proof-based class as sophomores, and they're able to use the OEIS to reach quite a bit further than I think they would otherwise. So, I had 3 pictures up, and we've talked about 2 of the groups of students. I have one more group to address with one more lesson I think they've gotten from the database. And this still is related to patterns. You just might not see it yet. One of the classical places where patterns show up is in the analysis of sorting algorithms. So in the art of computer programming, Donald Knuth addresses permutations that can be sorted via a stack. A stack is a last in, first out, yes, I said the right thing, last in, first out data structure. And I'm going to put the input above the stack, the output after the stack. At any step in time, you're allowed to take the first thing off the input and put it on the top of the stack, or you're allowed to take the top thing off the stack and put it on the end of the output. So in the top row here, you see that 1, 5, 4, 2, 3 can be sorted by one pass through a stack. I've sped up some of the steps. The 1 will go straight through. We'll use the stack to get the 4 and 5 in order and hold them for a minute. We run the 2 through, run the 3 through, take everything out, and I've sorted this stack, this permutation, into increasing order after one pass through the stack. But not every permutation can be sorted after just one pass through the stack. So here's an example of when not. If I try to sort 1, 5, 3, 4, 2, everything's good until the 3 is in the stack. And then I've reached an impasse. Because if I take the 3 out, I know I'm not going to get the identity permutation, because I haven't seen 2 yet. If I put the 4 on top of the 3, I've made something out of order that wasn't out of order before. And so there's not a way to get 1, 5, 3, 4, 2 into increasing order. Well, what's going on with the 3, 4, and 2 is exactly a 2, 3, 1 pattern. And in the art of computer programming, it's shown that a permutation is sortable after one pass through a stack, if and only if it avoids 2, 3, 1. So again, my trick to find problems for my undergrads is change one word. And my question a couple years ago was, what happens if the stack has a finite capacity? Because all the stack sorting I'd seen so far, for the most part, involved a stack you could put as many things as you felt like into. And, well, for example, here, if I take the permutation that was sortable on the previous slide and say, but wait, my stack can only hold 2 things, then you can't sort it after just one pass. And the students worked hard at this. I didn't tell them it was already known because they needed to start somewhere. And it turns out there's just one extra restriction here. You have to be able to be sorted in a regular stack, plus you can't have a decreasing subsequence of length depth of your stack plus 1. Okay, and they went on to look at permutations that were sortable after 2 passes, 3 passes, and different depth stacks, and started to get into some new things. But as a starting point, this is where we went. And the follow-up question is, well, how many permutations look like this? So now I'm going to use F sub D for the number of permutations sortable after one pass through a depth D stack. And the students used nice recursive properties of 2, 3, 1 avoiding permutations and got these generating functions. Now, have you seen these sequences before? Perhaps in the previous problem. The nice thing about OEIS is the previous project had happened about 1.5 years before this one. And so as the students started working and started getting data, they got to search and kept seeing references to the same resources every time and said, oh, this is something I should go look up. So it helped them connect problems on an even larger scale than before. So I think those are my 4 major lessons that my students have gotten, but the summary of it is OEIS makes them so much more powerful. When they've just come out of their first proof-based class and are excited but have far less context than a practitioner does, OEIS helps them write better proofs, it helps them generalize, and it helps them see all these connections they wouldn't otherwise. So Neil, thank you for making my job easier, and happy birthday. Credit to all my previous students that you saw a few slides ago. The ones in blue are still undergrads, juniors, and seniors. The ones in purple have all gone on to grad school in math, computer science, or statistics. And thanks to you for listening.
So was a coincidence that the 2 generated functions coincides?
Oh, we can explain it with a bijection.
No, but did you know about it before you gave the problem?
No.
Or it was a surprise?
It was a surprise to me, and then I helped them figure out why.
Any other questions?
Why is it that double list avoiding patterns have so much simpler generating functions than permutations compared? Would that continue for large patterns?
Yes, and in fact, all the things that you saw up here had rational generating functions, and that's not the case with permutation patterns. It's a more restrictive kind of thing. So if you just had the permutation, you only have one opportunity to grab a digit. And when you have the double list, you're borrowing from 2 copies of it. So it's like you've wrapped around. You have way more opportunities for the pattern to occur. Did that help a little
Well,
bit?
explain why the generating function is simpler. Explain why the numbers might be.
It explains why the numbers are quite a bit smaller. Yeah.
It's a lesson for another project.
Sure.
Sloan West and I conjectured, I famously proved the formula for the two-stack sortable. So I wonder if you do it with a restricted D.
We have 2-stack sortable in a depth 2-stack and then a depth 3-stack, and then it gets really, really hard. We have the enumeration in a depth 3-stack, and that was a lot of work. Yep.